Chapter 7 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 6. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 6 by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 7, Antietam. As soon as General McClellan was replaced in command of the Army of the Potomac, he began to put the forces in order, and the ease and rapidity with which this was accomplished show that both he and General Pope, with very different intentions, had equally exaggerated the state of their demoralization. The troops were not in so bad a condition at Centreville as Pope imagined, and the army that Mr. Lincoln handed over to McClellan at Washington was, both in numbers and morale, a formidable host. Its morning returns show an aggregate of over 100,000 men, and General McClellan himself reports that he had at Antietam 87,000. But the vast discrepancy between the force on paper and the effectives in battle gives a margin of which writers are apt to avail themselves according to their prejudices or prepossessions. General Palfrey, who took part in the campaign and who afterwards examined the reports on both sides with scrupulous care, says that in this single instance McClellan overstated the number of his troops in action, and that 70,000 would be nearer the mark. It is true he could afford it, as in the same estimate he very nearly doubled the number of the enemy. The Confederate rosters show some 45 brigades of infantry, exclusive of cavalry and artillery. Lee says in his report that the Battle of Antietam was fought by less than 40,000 troops on his side. McClellan's time for training and drilling his recovered army was brief, for within a few days the news came that Lee had crossed the Potomac into Maryland. There was no time now for indecision, and Lincoln's stern and constantly repeated injunction, "You must find and hurt this enemy now," had to be obeyed. General Lee has given in his own report a sufficiently clear statement of what he hoped to accomplish by his invasion of Maryland. The supplies of rich and productive districts were thus made accessible to his army, and he wished to prolong this state of affairs in every way desirable, and not to permit the season for active operations to pass without endeavoring to inflict further injury upon the enemy. He also makes an acknowledgment which shows that he, in common with others at Richmond, had been grossly deceived by the accounts which rebel refugees from Maryland and their sympathizing correspondents at home had given of the oppressive tyranny of Lincoln and the resentment it had caused in that commonwealth. He says, "The condition of Maryland encouraged the belief that the presence of our army, however inferior to that of the enemy, would induce the Washington government to retain all its available force to provide against contingencies which its course towards the people of that State gave it reason to apprehend. At the same time, it was hoped that military success might afford us an opportunity to aid the citizens of Maryland in any efforts they might be disposed to make to recover their liberties. The difficulties that surrounded them were fully appreciated, and we expected to derive more assistance in the attainment of our object from the just fears of the Washington government than from any active demonstration on the part of the people, unless success should enable us to give them assurance of continued protection." In a hasty note, he informed the Richmond government of his purpose and took the initial steps to execute it with great promptness. He crossed his entire army between the 4th and 7th of September near Leesburg and camped in the vicinity of Frederick. He took it for granted that our force at Harper's Ferry would be at once withdrawn. Thereafter he intended to move the army into Western Maryland, establish his communications with Richmond through the Shenandoah Valley, and then to move into Pennsylvania and draw McClellan from his base to fight in a field of his own selection. If all his surmises had been correct, if Miles had been withdrawn from Harper's Ferry, if Maryland had risen in revolt, if McClellan had allowed him to range through Western Maryland at his leisure, the plan would have been an admirable one and the results of it most fruitful. But all these expectations failed. After 2 days at Frederick, he found that Maryland was contented with the oppressor's yoke, and that Miles remained at Harper's Ferry. He therefore considered it necessary to detach a large portion of his force, under Jackson, McLaws, and Walker, to surround and capture the garrison at that place. The rest of the army withdrew from Frederick to Boonesboro. Meantime, McClellan was slowly approaching. He felt, of course, the need of more troops. With an army and trains about him so enormous that, as he says in his report, they would occupy 50 miles of road in marching order, he still paused on the 10th to write to General Halleck, begging for reinforcements. He first assures him that the capital is in no danger and that all the troops there may safely be sent to him. But in order to guard against any possible rejoinder, he adds, even if Washington should be taken while these armies are confronting each other, this would not, in my judgment, bear comparison with the ruin and disaster which would follow a signal defeat of this army, an opinion which has no especial value, except as showing what General McClellan's judgment was worth in such a matter. Except when he was in Washington, he always regarded its possible capture as a trifling affair. But his demand was complied with. Porter's corps was ordered to join him with a kind message from the President, which he acknowledged courteously, and then asked for the remainder of Keyes's corps. He was in no haste. He ordered his officers beforehand to avoid collisions. He attempted in his report to account for his tardy marching on the ground that the authorities at Washington wished him not to go too far from the capital. General Halleck says that no order capable of bearing this construction was ever given. He says, "I telegraphed him that he was going too far, not from Washington, but from the Potomac. I thought he should keep more upon the Potomac and press forward his left rather than his right, so as more readily to relieve Harper's Ferry, which was the point then in most immediate danger." But 2 days after the above-mentioned letter asking for reinforcements, McClellan received information which was enough to put a soul of enterprise into the veriest laggard that ever breathed. There never was a general so fruitlessly favored by fortune as McClellan, and never was such a piece of good luck offered even to him as that which fell into his hands on the 13th of September. He had been advancing in his leisurely manner from Washington on parallel roads, making only about 6 miles a day, when on the 13th he arrived at Frederick, and one of his officers brought to him Lee's special order of the 9th that a private soldier had found, containing his entire plan of campaign. By this he learned that his enemy was before him a day's march away, that Lee's whole force was inferior to his own, and that it was divided into 2 portions, one in camp near Boonesboro, and the other besieging Miles at Harper's Ferry. It is not too much to say that his enemy had been delivered into his hands. After he had read this order, an immediate contest between him and Lee, other things being equal, would have been like a fight between a man blindfolded and one having use of his eyes. He not only knew of the division of his enemy's army in half, but he knew where his trains, his rear guard, his cavalry were to march and to halt, and where the detached commands were to join the main body. He seemed to appreciate the importance of his discovery, but it was not in his nature to act promptly enough. Franklin was at Buckystown, about 12 miles east of South Mountain, a prolongation northward of the Blue Ridge beyond which Lee's army lay. Instead of giving him immediate orders to march with all possible speed to Harper's Ferry, he wrote at his leisure a long and judicious instruction directing him to march to that point the next day. The weather was perfect, the roads were in good order. McClellan knew there was no enemy between him and Crampton's Gap. Every possible consideration urged him to make use of every instant of time. The precious opportunity was neglected, and it was noon the next day, the 14th of September, when Franklin stormed the crest of the mountain after a brilliant and easy victory over General Cobb's detachment of McLaws's division, which had been left to guard the pass. The Union right wing spent the whole of the same day in a stubborn fight for the possession of Fox's and Turner's Gaps, some 6 miles farther north. After sharp fighting, in which General Jesse L. Reno, an officer of the highest merit, was killed, and Colonel Hayes, afterwards President of the United States, was wounded, advanced positions were secured. At neither Crampton's nor Turner's was the victory pushed to advantage. Franklin did nothing to relieve the beleaguered garrison at Harper's Ferry, and the force at Turner's Gap rested on the ground that they had won until, when the mists of the morning cleared away on the 15th, they saw the enemy had retreated from their front. Much valuable time had been lost, and more than time, for early on the morning of the 15th the blundering and bewildered defense of Harper's Ferry had ceased by the surrender of the garrison, its unhappy commander having been killed after he had displayed the white flag. But McClellan had not yet lost all his advantage, and the sacrifice of Harper's Ferry would have been amply compensated if he had moved at once with all possible speed upon Lee, who, with only Longstreet's and D. H. Hill's troops, had taken up his position at Sharpsburg. Jackson was still south of the Potomac. He had no fear of night marches, and was making all possible speed to join Lee through the day and night of the 15th. The force of McLaws got away from in front of Franklin, and though making a long detour and crossing the Potomac twice, still joined the main army at Sharpsburg on the 17th. All this time, while the scattered detachments of Lee were moving with the utmost expedition to join their main body, making 2 or 3 times the distance which separated Lee from McClellan, the latter made his preparations for an attack as if, to quote Johnston again, time was of no especial value to him. On the 15th he marched down to Antietam Creek and placed his soldiers in position. He rode from end to end of his line, enjoying one of the grandest greetings ever given by an army to its commander. The thunder of cheers which met him at every point showed that there was no lack of morale in that mighty army, and that they were equal to any service their beloved commander might choose to require of them. It seems almost incredible as we write it, and it will appear inexplicable to such readers as may come after us, that McClellan made no movement during the afternoon of Monday the 15th, and did nothing during the entire day of the 16th but to advance a portion of his right wing across Antietam Creek, and this while the ragged legions of Lee were streaming in from across the Potomac to take up their positions for the impending conflict. Every minute which he thus let slip was paid for in the blood of Union soldiers next day. Never had McClellan's habit of procrastination served him so ill a turn as during the whole day of the 16th. Lee's error of dividing his army would have been fatal to him if even on the morning of the 16th McClellan had advanced upon him in force. The loss of the afternoon of the 15th in that case would scarcely have been felt. The reduction of Harper's Ferry had taken a day longer than Lee expected, and when night fell, the divisions of McLaws, Anderson, A. P. Hill, and Walker were still beyond the Potomac. He would have been compelled to withstand the attack of McClellan's whole army with nothing but the divisions of D. R. Jones and D. H. Hill on the right and center, and of Hood, Ewell, and J. R. Jones on the left. But before noon of the 17th, most of Lee's forces were on the ground, and the rest arrived during the battle. McClellan had rejected the proffered favors of fortune. His delay had given back to Lee all the advantages afforded McClellan by the separation of Lee's army and the discovery of his plan of campaign. Lee had had unbroken leisure for 48 hours to study his ground and the dispositions of his antagonist, which had been made in plain view under his eyes. Lee's advantage of position was fully equal to McClellan's advantage of numbers, and it was therefore on even terms between the two armies that the battle of Antietam began. The ground was highly favorable to Lee. In front of him was Antietam Creek, the high ground, some of it wooded, affording an advantageous position and cover for his batteries. There was little field for manoeuvring, and little was attempted. From daylight till dark of the 17th the battle went on. There was nothing of it but sheer, persistent, brutal slaughter. McClellan's plan was to throw forward his right wing, the corps of Hooker leading, supported by that of Mansfield and by those of Sumner and Franklin, if necessary. When the battle became well engaged on the right, the left wing under Burnside was to cross the lower bridge to try to turn the enemy's right. On this simple plan the battle was contested. Hooker advanced early in the morning and fought until his corps, giving and receiving about equal injuries, was shattered to pieces, and himself borne from the field, severely wounded. General Meade succeeded to the command, and Mansfield came to his assistance. The latter's corps also did heroic service, and its veteran commander was killed in the front of his foremost line. His corps was led during the rest of the day by General A.S. Williams. As the Union left remained entirely inactive, Lee was able to use most of his force on our right, and his resistance was so obstinate that Sumner's corps was drawn into the conflict, where it met with heavy losses. Richardson, one of the best division commanders in the army, received a mortal hurt, and Sedgwick was twice wounded. Before the battle ended on the right, even Franklin's corps, which McClellan had intended to hold in reserve, was drawn into the whirlpool of blood and fire. Corps by corps, division by division, one might almost say brigade by brigade, those brave and devoted troops were hurled in succession without intelligent plan, without any special concert of action, against Lee's left. The carnage was frightful, the result in no proportion to the terrible expense. It was afternoon before the left wing under Burnside began its part of the work. The lower bridge was crossed about 1 o'clock, and the west bank gained, but no further advance was made by Burnside until after 3 o'clock. He then moved forward his forces under General Cox's command upon the enemy's right, making good progress until late in the afternoon, as if fortune, weary of having her favors rejected by General McClellan, had turned to the other side. The division of A.P. Hill, which had marched 17 miles in 7 hours, arrived on the field from Harper's Ferry and made a vigorous attack upon our extreme left, killed General Isaac P. Rodman, and threw his division into some disorder. This unlooked-for demonstration checked the advance of the Federal column, and it fell back a little distance to the hills near the Antietam. Night came on, and the long, desperate battle was at an end. The tactical advantage was with General McClellan. On his left, his center, and his right he had gained a little ground. Both armies had suffered losses which it shocks the sense to contemplate. They were almost equal, over 12,000 killed and wounded on the Union side, over 11,000 on the Confederate. But Lee's loss was more than 1/4 of his army, while McClellan's was only 1/6 of his. In his report, General McClellan says, "The night brought with it grave responsibilities, whether to renew the attack on the 18th or to defer it, even with the risk of the enemy's retirement, was the question before me." There could be little doubt of his decision of the question. He was keenly alive to the sufferings of his army. He loved them, and was loved by them in return. The piled heaps of the slain, the thousands of wounded and dying, the wreck and havoc of the conquered field, all impressed his imagination so powerfully that he was unable to conceive the worse condition of the enemy. There rose before his mind also an appalling picture of the consequences that would ensue if he risked another battle and lost it. He saw Lee's army marching in triumph on Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York, the country ravaged, the cause lost. Every impulse of his heart and conscience forbade him to assume so enormous a responsibility. He would not absolutely decide which course to adopt, but after his habit concluded to wait until the 19th before making a final decision. The occasion, however, would not wait for him. Lee knew, if McClellan did not, that the Confederate army was in no condition to risk another battle. The straggling of McClellan's force was one of the reasons that induced him to delay. No doubt there was a great deal of it in his command. One day Mr. Lincoln, exasperated at the discrepancy between the aggregate of troops he had sent to McClellan and the number McClellan reported as having received, exclaimed in a grotesque simile, "Sending men to that army is like shoveling fleas across a barnyard. Not half of them get there." But the case on the other side was worse still. Lee reported to Jefferson Davis on the 21st of September that the efficiency of his army was paralyzed by the loss to its ranks of the numerous stragglers. On the morning after the battle, he said, General Evans reported to me on the field where he was holding the front position that he had but 120 of his brigade present, and that the next brigade to his, that of General Garnett, consisted of but 100 men. General Pendleton reported that the brigades of Generals Lawton and Armistead, left to guard the fort at Shepherdstown, together contained but 600 men. This, he added feelingly, is a woeful condition of affairs. But of course General McClellan had no personal knowledge of this, and as we have seen in the course of this narrative, he was utterly destitute of those intuitions of the situation and the intention of his enemy which we find in all great commanders. The fight of the day before had been so terrible in the struggle and carnage, he had made his personal influence so little felt on the field, he had gained so little advantage in comparison with his frightful losses, that it would be unjust to expect to find in him on the morning of the 18th that alacrity and elation of victory which would have impelled him in pursuit of his shattered enemy. Beaten as Lee was, his promising campaign brought to a disastrous failure by his own error, he was still less affected by it than was McClellan by his victory. He even thought for the moment, before twilight had settled on the battle of the 17th, of executing with his usual instrument his usual movement, of sending Stonewall Jackson by the left to attack the right flank of McClellan's army. He opposed a bold front to his ill fortune, and closed his description of the battle by saying that he deemed it injudicious to push his advantage further. McClellan was almost alone in his decision not to continue the battle on the 18th. General Burnside, who commanded on the left, testified that he thought the attack should be renewed at early dawn, and gave this opinion to McClellan the night of the battle. General McClellan said he would think the matter over and make up his mind before morning, and a staff officer of Burnside's was kept in waiting through the night at McClellan's headquarters to learn his decision. General Franklin, in command of the center, also testified that he showed McClellan a position on our right of great importance and advised an attack on that place in the morning. He said there was no doubt that we could carry it, as we had plenty of artillery bearing on it. He thought that by this means the whole left flank of the enemy would have been uncovered. When asked what reasons were given for rejecting this plan, he repeated McClellan's customary fatal excuse for delay, that he would prefer to wait for reinforcements. Hooker, who had commanded the right wing, was also of the opinion that the attack should be resumed, although his wounds would have prevented his taking part in it. But it was too much to expect of General McClellan that he should follow such advice. He had had, it is true, a moment of elation on the morning of the 15th, after the engagement at South Mountain. To attack an enemy in position and drive him was to McClellan so new a sensation that he was evidently greatly exhilarated by his success at Turner's Gap. He reported Lee as admitting they had been shockingly whipped, and as making for Shepherdstown in a perfect panic. But after the terrible conflict at Antietam, the cold fit came on, and his only dispatches to Washington were of his heavy losses and of holding what he had gained. He evidently thought more of being attacked on that day than of attacking. "The battle," he says, "will probably be renewed to day. Send all the troops you can by the most expeditious route." It was therefore with feelings of the greatest relief that he saw Lee's rear guard disappear across the Potomac, and in the forenoon of the 19th he joyfully telegraphed to Washington, "Our victory was complete. The enemy is driven back into Virginia. Maryland and Pennsylvania are now safe." The President received this news, as was natural, with mingled gratitude and disappointment. He was glad and thankful for the measure of success which had been achieved, but the high hope he had entertained of destroying Lee's army before it recrossed the Potomac was baffled. His constant entreaty to McClellan, from the time he put him in command of the army up to the day of the battle, was, "Please do not let him get off without being hurt." It was with this hope and purpose that he had given McClellan everything he asked for, infusing his own indomitable spirit into all the details of work at the War Department and the headquarters of the army. It was by his order that McClellan had been pushed forward, that Porter had been detached from the defense of Washington, that the militia of Pennsylvania had been hurried down to the border. He did not share General McClellan's illusion as to the monstrous number of the enemy opposed to him, and when he looked at the vast aggregate of the Army of the Potomac by the morning report on the 20th of September, which shows 93,149 present for duty, he could not but feel that the result was not commensurate with the efforts made and the resources employed. End of chapter 7.